is vital that the EU's domestic energy market flourish, as well as having a positive trade of energy molecules with the world.
A more relevant question is this: is competition better than monopoly?
A balance of energy imports and exports does promise to ensure a reliable and resilient network of supply to consumers across the EU.
LNG and EU energy security will both remain bipartisan priorities within the United States.
It is my belief that no country or region is truly energy independent.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this humdinger of an event this afternoon. It's the last of our Let's Meets for 2020. We've had a great series for you, and we're really finishing with, I would say, a highlight of the political year, the US election and the impact of the US election on trade and energy with the European Union. I'm delighted to say I've got an absolutely top-class panel with me today. We've got good representatives from the United States. We've got a representative from the European Commission, all knowledgeable about the energy situation, all knowledge about EU-US relationships. So we're really going to hear a lot about the inside of how these things work and what we can expect in the next 4 years. Now, I know we haven't got an election outcome yet, ladies and gentlemen. I think there are many of us who feel it's probably going in a specific way, but that shouldn't stop us having a good discussion this afternoon. And I suppose in our business, none of us mind a little bit of speculation as to what the outcomes could be and what the outcomes will mean. But no, let's be very honest. I think that this is a really great time to be discussing the American election and what it means for the EU. In the recent years, of course, we've seen more of a strained relationship across the Atlantic in certain areas, but actually a very strong relationship in things like liquefied natural gas. Will this be something that continues for the next 4 years? Will there be changes? We all have to see what our experts think about it. And I know that I, for one, am absolutely delighted that we've got them with us today. And I'm really looking forward to hear what they have to say and what they think about those things that are going on. Now, as you know, those of you who come regularly, this is all about interaction. And so I ask you, please make sure that you do ask us questions. Please go into the Q&A, send in the questions that you've got. All of our panelists will be very happy to answer questions that you put in. So write your questions, listen to what they're saying, write your questions, and I will act as the conduits to give you your voice. Make sure you say who you are and who you work for so that we get a good context of why the question is being asked. And then, indeed, our experts will do the very best to respond to them in a way that is satisfactory. Well, I think without further ado, I think I haven't forgotten anything else. So I think without any further ado, we'll begin today's event. And indeed, I'm very happy to say that we do have with us one of the European Commission's leading experts on international energy relations, Anne-Charlotte Bonneville, who's been working at the European Commission since 1996, and indeed is currently responsible for relationships, international relationships in DG Energy. And I think from our point of view, Anne-Charlotte, we'd be very interested to hear what you think. Well, what's the context of the situation in relation to EU-US energy relations, and what's the European view of the outcome of the election, and what will it mean for our coming 4 years? So only a few things that I want you to answer, Charlotte. But as I say, great to have you on board today. I'll pass it over to you, please. The opening keynote is yours.
Thank you very much, James, and dear Brian, dear Fred, dear members of Eurogas, dear online participants. So it's my pleasure to join you for this panel today. And thank you for inviting me to join this interesting discussion, indeed very, very timely. So our topic today, the outcome of the US elections and its impact on the EU-US energy relations, is still unfolding as we talk. So with everyone following closely the developments that are unfolding in real time. So as far as I am aware, neither of the candidates has conceded. So I will abstain from any comment related to the process or the possible result of the US elections. What is sure in any case is that this is a very close race, much tighter than opinion polls had predicted. and probably one of the most competitive elections in the history of the US. So I will structure my opening remarks in two parts. I will first recall the importance of our transatlantic energy partnership and provide a few recent concrete examples, which I believe could be relevant to our audience today with a keen interest on natural gas. And I will then list some possible topics of further engagement. So first, our partnership. So as you all know, the EU-US Energy Council provides the overall framework of our transatlantic energy cooperation, and it has done so since 2009. It's a great example of successful cooperation, not only with the high-level ministerial dialogue addressing key transatlantic energy issues, and the last ministerial meeting was in July 2018 in Brussels, but also the engagement with industry associations such as the LNG Alliance and Eurogas through the joint organization of business-to-business events. So we've had very successful events on small modular reactors and on promoting the transatlantic LNG trade. So you all remember our very successful B2B on LNG in May 2019 in Brussels. And we hope soon to organize follow-up events and expand on, to other topics such as offshore renewables or hydrogen. So now on the good examples, I would start with the EU-US LNG trade. And thank you for showing the slide on the screen so that I can elaborate on it. So the growth of our LNG trade is one of the success stories of our transatlantic cooperation, and we believe it will remain so, whatever the outcome of the election is. So for example, during the first 2 months of this year, before the COVID pandemic hit us, the US share in total EU LNG imports reached 33%. So this is well ahead of the EU's traditional LNG suppliers such as Qatar, Nigeria, and Algeria, and also well ahead of new LNG suppliers such as the Russian Federation. So this can be seen in the charts at the bottom left and at the top right on the slide. So during this same period, the EU market took more than 50% of total US exports of LNG. So to put things into perspective, just 2 years before this high point, the LNG trade between the EU and the US was virtually non-existent. So this is a true success story of our transatlantic relationship. And it is, of course, true that, and you can see it on the slide as well, since the COVID pandemic impacted demand and facilitated very low competitive prices of gas in the EU LNG cargoes from the US decreased. But yet, as market conditions return to normal, we can expect the market share of the US to get closer to the levels that we had at the beginning of this year. So we have actually witnessed this in October. Based on the latest data that we have, we see that more than 1.5 BCM was imported from the US, and this is a doubling of the volume compared to the previous month. So more generally, US suppliers are capable of adapting very quickly to market signals. They contribute to the EU's energy security by providing important flexibility services, by linking the actual amounts supplied to the current price conditions. And this is seen in the good price volume correlation in the chart on the bottom right. So as I said, this is a success story of our transatlantic relationship. However, let me be clear, the strong increase in US LNG volumes was not only the result of favorable market conditions. It was also supported at the highest political level on both sides of the Atlantic. And I would only point to the meeting of the presidents of the United States and the European Commission in 2018, as well as our joint business-to-business summit in Brussels in May 2019, with the participation of Commissioner Arias Cañete on the EU side and of Energy Secretary Perry and an impressive delegation on US side. So at this point, I would, of course, particularly like to thank Fred Hutchison for his invaluable assistance in making our joint EU-US LNG B2B event such a huge success. And also Sempra for the participation of the Chief Commercial Officer of Sempra LNG, Mr. Chrisman, in one of the panels. So staying on gas, this remains a major feature of our EU-US cooperation in the years to come. And it is important in this context that the EU and the US work together to underpin the role of gas by addressing a key environmental challenge, which is methane emissions. In our relations with third countries, we will be raising the issue of methane emissions in line with our recently unveiled methane strategy and in the context of the European Green Deal. So we intend to do so in our bilateral engagements with key partner countries and in the relevant multilateral fora, be it the United Nations, the G7, the G20, the International Energy Agency, or the Clean Energy Ministerial Meeting. So the US is a key partner that already implements high regulatory standards, and we would most welcome an exchange of best practices in this field. Let me say that the EU and the US are not going in different directions, even though some measures were rolled back by the current administration. We both agree that we have to step up measurements, reporting, and verification as a necessary condition to the successful reduction of methane emissions. And in the US, this is underwritten by federal and state level regulations on methane measurement, reporting, and verification. So we do not expect that these initiatives on methane will impact US LNG sales to the EU. Indeed, we are implementing equivalent standards that are either enforced at state or federal level in the US. So basically, the overall philosophy of measuring, reporting, and verifying is the same. However, of course, European purchasers may show a preference for the best in class, and so there could be impacts within the US market with those with the best performance getting the best terms in the European markets. Allow me now to share some thoughts on what could be the priorities in the future for our transatlantic energy cooperation. So I would like to recall the State of the Union speech of President von der Leyen of last September, where she stated, and here I will quote, so she said, Europe must deepen and refine its partnerships with its friends and allies, and this starts with revitalizing our most enduring of partnerships. We might not always agree with recent decisions by the White House, but we will always cherish the transatlantic alliance based on shared values and history and an unbreakable bond between our people. So whatever may happen later this year, we are ready to build a new transatlantic agenda to strengthen our bilateral partnership, be it on trade, tech, or taxation. So as you can see, we stand ready to work with the transitional teams of President Trump or President Biden on a broad, comprehensive transatlantic agenda, irrespective of who resides in the White House post-January 2021. In the area of energy, potential themes could range from LNG and global supply chains to the energy system resilience, the organization of further B2B events, ITER in the nuclear field, the European Green Deal, the post-COVID green recovery, etc. So it goes, of course, without saying that we are following very closely the outcome of the presidential elections and the emerging balance of power in the Senate and in the House of Representatives. So we believe that the specific themes that we have identified as our priorities will be largely shared with by whichever administration takes office in the US in January. Of course, it will be easier to speak about the Green Deal and the green recovery with the Biden administration, but still we see a lot of promising grounds for a very vibrant transatlantic partnership in the years to come. So I will stop here, and very keen also to hear the other panelists and also have a dialogue with the audience. Thank you very much, James.
No, thanks to you, Anne-Charlotte, and indeed a very, very suitable opening to put the context, and indeed with a good focus on LNG, as indeed we have important players from America with us here today. I think that there's probably a lot of people who do share that view that indeed the priorities should be the same going forward. Between the EU and the US. Of course, the administrations may have different ideas about how things should go. We had a couple of questions that came in whilst you were speaking. Essentially, both of them relates to the recent LNG contract discussions between when the US and the French government's point of view. when you see these sort of things that are coming up headlines in the press, whether they're true or not, it suggests that there might be some difference between the way that the EU and the US see the future for LNG. As the European Commission, would you give any credence to that kind of thinking, or do you stick very strongly to the point of view that you have, as you outlined, that the way forward is the way that we have, and it will continue whatever the situation is? I'm not going to give you the direct questions because they're asking about commercial contracts, but in the end, you can't do. So it's much more for me, it's about the relationship and the implications of what may or may not have happened in the French government relating to LNG cargoes.
Well, yes, thank you, James. As I said, I think LNG and the cooperation on LNG trade and on gas will remain the main topic of our cooperation with the US in the years to come. At the same time, you see the direction of the EU climate and energy policy from today until 2050. So we need to move towards and achieve our 2050 ambition of climate neutrality. And for this, we need to use all available synergies between energy carriers, which means between electricity, renewable and low carbon gases, heating, transport, agriculture, industrial sectors. So we think we will still need gaseous fuels in our energy mix. And this is clearly shown by our long-term decarbonization strategy by 2050. But it will be important to work on decarbonizing the gas sector. And if we want gaseous fuel to continue to be an important part of the mix, we will need to promote climate neutral gases. So, of course, in this transition, natural gas will play a role, and this is also fully recognized by our long-term decarbonization strategy. But it means that, as I said, we will have to tackle the issue of methane emissions. Mm-hmm. So I think this will become a prominent topic in our discussion with the US. And as I said, we would be keen to organize a second edition of our B2B on LNG. And we would like to have a conversation and a discussion with the US government, but also US industry players on how to mitigate methane emissions when it comes to LNG. And I mean, measure the carbon footprint of LNG and how, and to assess the best cost-effective ways to reach a climate neutral or green LNG.
I think then I'll give you one more question and then we will move on. It's actually directly relating to what you've just said. It's from Elena Medvedeva, and she's saying, should LNG cargoes in the future have green certificates to explain things you said, methane, CO2 emissions? Is that something the Commission is looking at, thinking about?
Well, as you know, we will be issuing a new gas legislative package next year. It's in the Commission Works program, and we will have also to work on the regulatory framework for our LNG terminals. So I cannot really prejudge the content of this legislation, but now we are speaking of green certificates for the origin of electricity, as you know. It's also in the context of the carbon border adjustment mechanism that will be put in place next year. So, I mean, I would not like to prejudge again the content of the legislation, but I mean, the idea of having green certificates for LNG exports, I mean, why not? So it's being investigated, and yeah.
Well, you heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. It's possible. No, thanks for that, Anne-Charlotte. That's great. Do stay on the line. We will come back, of course, and there will be a general discussion at the end after we've had all of our expert inputs. But that was a superb start. As I said, really grateful to have you with us today, which is indeed still a very exciting day. Our next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is Brian Kelly, who is the Vice President of Government Affairs for Sempra Energy. Now, some of you may not be familiar with Sempra, but Brian will give you a good overview. But I can say it's one of the largest energy companies in North America, involved in renewables, LNG, one of the biggest distribution system operators in the world, if not the biggest. And so a lot of interesting, different issues at stake through the American election. Brian, tell us, what is this situation? First of all, tell us what's going to happen. Then tell us, what does it mean for Sempra Energy? Over to you. Nice to have you with us, Brian. Welcome.
Thanks, James. Good afternoon. And, Fred and I, good morning. And Charlotte, thank you for the comments. Really enjoyed those. We were going to definitely have some things to talk about in the future. For those that are on the call, I hope you have enjoyed the U.S. circus. It's not quite over just yet. It will be over here soon. Look, I think Fred would agree with me that Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States. There is no way that Trump can catch up, and things are trending. As my son has texted me just now in the last few minutes, there is Joe-mentum, and Joe will become the next president, the 46th president. So we will not have a clarity on finality until probably the next 3 weeks, but that doesn't mean that the outcome has not been set. So the way the U.S. operates is states have to certify votes, and they double check and triple check, but the outcome will not change. So it is purely my belief that Joe Biden will be the next president, will be sworn in on January 24th, and we will start that now. So something Ann Charlotte mentioned, I think this goes to the context of what I want to talk about today, and that is that the Senate will likely remain in Republican hands. So we will have divided government. Now, that is, from a business perspective, that is the best news that you can have, having divided government. That means that things will not swing dramatically in one direction or the other. And so today we are 4 seats that are still left to be decided, and barring any cataclysm, all 4 seats will go to the Republicans, giving them a 2-seat majority in the Senate. There are still 40 to 50 House races still left to be decided, but Republicans picked up 7 seats. So, in context where there was belief of a blue wave, it was actually a red undertow. Even though Joe Biden wins, Republicans did amazingly well at the Senate and at the House level, and even in the state level. So what that says is 2 things. One, there was no blue wave, there was no green wave. And with a GOP Senate, that relegates energy policy for an administration to only tinkering around the edges. They really don't have a mandate. And a renewable energy transition for a Democratic administration will be a big, heavy lift. Not to say that there will not be some, but it will have to be bipartisan. And with no mandate, that means there has to be compromise. I know in some parlances in the US, compromise is a dirty word, but as an institutionalist, that is the best word that you could have, is that one side doesn't get all that they want. So as an aside, I think James mentioned, for those of you that are not familiar with Sempra, I think it's important as we talk about what this means, not only for the US, but for a company like Sempra. So Sempra is not the largest energy utility company in the US, but we provide energy to the most customers. We have 40 million customers in the US, and we have utilities that are power generation as well as distribution in Texas and California. Just those 2 states are 2 of the largest economies in the world. We're also the largest energy provider in Mexico outside of Pemex. So we have LNG facilities in Louisiana and in Mexico and in Texas. And it is our belief in the next 3 to 5 years, we could be the largest privately held LNG company in the world. So we are very bullish on moving molecules globally. We're very bullish on energy transition. And, and Charlotte, to your comment about the Paris net zero, we are all in on that message. And we believe that it is not only achievable, but we give it with caveats that we believe that data science and technology have to be the baseline to this conversation, and you must tackle it decade by decade. Anything that tries to go 20 years or 30 years out is going to fail because you are basing it upon what you think, not what you know. And we believe that having sound data and sound science with sound technology will win the day. So what does a Democratic White House with a Joe Biden and a Republican Senate look like for US-EU relations? I think the first thing that will happen day one in a Biden administration on January 24th or 25th is that he will rejoin the Paris Accord. As you know, today is the last day the U.S. is in. So the U.S. is officially out. So now I believe Biden will get back in pretty quickly. And, and Charlie, you mentioned this, and I firmly believe that he will attempt to set limits on methane and CO2e. I think you will see whoever he picks for his Secretary of State, that you will see foreign affairs dominated by climate policy. And that could be everything from R&D with regard to hydrogen, to green financing, to some form of energy transition. Again, unsure how that will look, but I firmly believe that is also something that will happen. When you look at what will happen from a finance standpoint, energy innovation tied to infrastructure and economic recovery, I think from a congressional and White House standpoint, will be first out of the blocks. That they need stimulus. They need to have energy infrastructure. And the uneasiness in terms of from an American voter perspective on climate, they were concerned about climate, but climate did not drive this election by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, in most areas where oil and gas development, you saw Republicans beating Democrats because of the fear of things that were said about the Green New Deal and hydraulic fracturing. That those that were in heavily development states like Pennsylvania, Democrats that were in those areas lost those races. And it looks like there are 3 seats in the lower house that will be lost by Democrats because President Trump tied hydraulic fracturing to those seats. Therefore, climate will have to come through energy transition, not climate for the sake of climate by itself. Now, on regulatory issues, this is where a Joe Biden can have success with a split Congress, and that is through regulatory changes. Look, he can roll back most of what Trump has put in place with regard to environmental rules, and everything. And I guess for Sempra, our biggest fears are green financing, how the U.S. and also the EU will work together on defining risk with regard to energy infrastructure. And Charlotte, I will tell you that is a concern that we have, that pipelines and LNG facilities would be declared environmental risk. And when you're building multi-billion-dollar facilities, that last 50 years, I mean, it's, with private financing, that could become very tough. And the only place that we could get financing would be the Chinese. And that is not acceptable to us in the US, and I know it would not be acceptable to the EU. The other things that we will see coming out of this administration, and that is environmental justice. And I actually raised this with James, that the term environmental justice and how that is defined for people will be a big issue. It is still an amorphous term, but we think that it will drive an agenda. The other 2 issues I will raise just quickly is ESG, environmental and social governance, that there will be a global effort, as we already seen, but we believe a Biden administration will push very hard for ESG into everything that happens. And the last is and Charlotte raised this too, carbon pricing. And we believe that there will be some form of carbon pricing, and an administration will use that in our foreign policy efforts. The last thing I will say from a Sempra perspective is we have a perspective about system value framework. And we believe that everything should be looked at holistically. Now, there are regional issues, there are country issues, there are, geographic issues, North America, Europe. However, as our CEO often says, the air in China will be in California in 3 days. And that is very true. And when we can lower emissions by moving LNG from the US to the EU or to Africa or to Asia, and we can reduce coal and we can reduce high intense energy sources, that is great for the planet. And we have to stop thinking about small areas, we have to be thinking big. And if we can think about how we can reduce emissions on a global scale, that is a win for everybody. And I would hope that the US and the EU can work together and be thinking about providing reliable and resilient energy that reduces energy poverty, provides access and affordability to everyone. And it's not just based upon the EU and the US, but it's about providing that to the world. And I think we could do that in spades. So James, thank you for the time. And it's always good to be with Fred and Charlotte. Great to be with you today.
Oh, that's super, Brian. Thanks for that. That was a real tour de force, a great overview of everything that's going on over there. And of course, the global front. And you've covered so many important terms. You know, it's been a great value, I think, for all of us listening in to hear what you've got to say there. Now, I can see you've got a couple of questions that have come in. One is about energy. It's good, it's controversial, but I'll come to that second. The first one's more technical about the actual, what you were saying about the presidential election. And that is that, you know, what about all the lawsuits that Trump has filed and how will they impact the presidency? Because basically it's an anonymous attendee who's put this forward. I don't know who it is exactly, but they're saying that, you know, is it sure that Biden will be the next president? There are these lawsuits. Can we dismiss them that easily?
Well, I'm sure if they're anonymous, they're a lawyer. And so, and no one's judging. But look, again, this is a conversation I had with my son last night. If you have 100,000 votes that have already been cast, in a lawsuit, you have to invalidate those 100,000 votes. And that is the bar of getting that and being successful is so difficult. And there's a old Washington, D.C. saying, when in doubt, run in circles, scream and shout. And Donald Trump can scream and shout all he wants, but lawsuits are not going to change an outcome by invalidating a legal vote. And you have to prove that that vote is illegal. Mm-hmm. So again, James, to that question, it may take 3 weeks or 4 weeks to validate the election, but that is not going to change the outcome.
Smoke and mirrors kind of thing, isn't it? To set up these lawsuits, just keep things going and make it more exciting. But yeah, okay, it's good. And that somebody giving you the two sides of the coin. Somebody was very, very keen on the aspect of the presidential election. Somebody saying, well, Stephen Rose, also one of our members, for RWE, is asking, do you think there is a bipartisan consensus in the US on blocking Nord Stream 2? And will there be new sanction measures in December? What's your understanding of what's going on in relation to, well, I mean, it's getting a lot of headlines, let's be clear, and I think it's reasonable to ask you, how do you see things going? Maybe it's more broad in relation to relationships with Russia, but this question focusing on Nord Stream 2. Do you think that bipartisan consensus will continue?
So I do, and I know Fred will want to address this as well. Look, it is going to be critical, and I want to give Joe Biden credit. Joe Biden was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for years, and he has a special place in his heart for not only Europe but for Eastern Europe. And I do believe that he will continue to ramp up sanctions with Russia as well. And look, Nord Stream 2, and for not only from our perspective, from a Sempra perspective, from Europe, we think it's bad. I will be very curious about how a Biden administration approaches Germany. And we've seen the tensions between Merkel and Trump, but I do believe that there will be tensions even in a Biden administration, that having Nord Stream 2 go away and that pressure against that is going to be very important. The other thing that I will add is that I do not see a fundamental change in the US-China relationship, even in a Biden administration, because it's all part and parcel of the same thing. So as China asserts itself on climate, as China asserts itself on energy, and even with Russia, I think there will still be antagonism. It will just be channeled in different ways, not necessarily the same way, but there will be antagonism.
That's very interesting, Brian. I will say that. I mean, in essence, what you're saying is geopolitically and certainly in relations towards Russia and China, therefore you're not expecting much of a change, even though you're convinced there'll be Biden that comes in. I suppose, I can play devil's advocate, and I won't go into the full debate here, but just say, I'm sure there are plenty of people, perhaps myself included, that would have thought that Biden would maybe take a different view in some aspects of his relationship, certainly with Germany, for example. But let's come back to that when we get around to the overall discussion. We've got 35 minutes through. We've got 25 minutes left. We haven't got around to Fred Hutchison yet. And Fred, it's great, absolutely great to have you with us today. Fred is the president and CEO of LNG Allies. And basically, it's an association that deals with LNG. And as Charlotte has said, we've got great friends of ours, great friends of the European Commission. And indeed, we've done some great work together involving around that 2019 B2B summit. And Fred, I would probably put the same post to you. We'd be really interested in your view on what's going to happen. See if you've got any difference to Brian, or whether you're going to support Brian's point of view. And secondly, I think more importantly, in your state as you are LNG, what does this all mean for LNG? What are the next 4 years going to look like? Are you going to be as positive as Charlotte? Over to you, Fred, and welcome. Great to have you with us.
All right. Thank you, Brian. It is great to join you all today. And Charlotte, thank you for your very kind words. LNG Allies has truly enjoyed our relationship and working with DG Energy and others at the Commission. We've already accomplished some really terrific things, and we look forward to a very productive future. James, thank you for all of the work that Eurogas and your partners do in representing the natural gas industry in Brussels and throughout Europe. LNG Allies is the trade association of the U.S. LNG industry. We represent companies that are building LNG facilities, companies that have permits and would like to build U.S. LNG facilities. We also represent companies that are upstream oil and gas producers in the United States. So we've been around since about 2013 and have a real strong partnership across Europe, both in the East as well as in the West. This election is full of surprises. Brian is right in the analysis. I share his analysis that that Biden looks destined to be the president. That just are very few pathways that could work for President Trump at this particular point. Yes, there's going to be lots of fussing and fighting. You have to remember, we are the United States of America, right? And sometimes we're united and sometimes we're America, but we're always states, right? And, why we don't have stuff all, one thing, right? With one system to vote. And it's because the states control all that. States control our oil and gas industry. They're the primary regulators on an environmental standpoint of what happens in the United States on oil and gas. So it's all about the states. So let me say several things about the election itself, and then talk a little bit about the questions about LNG, methane, US-EU partnership, all of those things. So Brian's right. The Biden looks ahead for the White House. Honestly, that's not the most important race that we've been watching. What we've been watching in the United States is what happens in the legislative branch, because over the last 20 years or so, we've had this situation for which our country has been politically divided. And so at some point, one or other houses of Congress changes from the Democrats to the Republicans, and it shifts back and forth. And what that has meant essentially is that it's become very difficult for Congress to actually legislate on any big picture kinds of issues. They just don't, you have Democrats in one and Republicans in the other, somebody else holds the White House. You can never get together to get a lot of things done. So the entire focus has been on the executive branch. And so, yes, there are things that President Biden, if he's elected, is going to come in and he's going to do right away. He's going to come in right away and he's going to get us back in the Paris Accord. He is absolutely going to move on an executive front to begin the process to reverse some of the regulatory reforms that President Trump has initiated, which were to roll back the Obama regulations and rules. So we're two steps back and one step forward in the United States. So what happens in the Congress is just like hugely important, and particularly what happens in the Senate, because the Senate operates under a series of really arcane rules. And in essence, you've got to get 60 votes in order to pass pretty much anything, and that's because of a Senate rule. Well, there's been a lot of concern that a Democratic Senate could, in retaliation both for the recent Supreme Court confirmation or other issues, change that rule and go to a 51 senator vote in order to pass legislation. So that doesn't seem like that's happening. We have a little bit of a strange circumstance going on in the state of Georgia. Right now, there are sort of 4 outstanding seats. 2 of those, one in Alaska, one in North Carolina, are almost surely destined to go to the Republicans, which would put the Republicans at 50 and the Democrats at 48. There'll be 2 seats in the state of Georgia that'll go to a runoff. Again, remember, it's states. And the state of Georgia has a rule that you have to get above 50% in order to be elected. So one of those senators, one of the sitting senators, we have 2 seats that are up there because of a special election. The person didn't serve out at 6 years. So January, there's at least going to be 1 special election in Georgia. And if the Democrats keep forcing the vote down on one of the Republicans, he too could end up below that 50% threshold, and then there'd be an election in Georgia in January, possibly 2 elections. So that's something to keep an eye on. Not likely to change the outcome, but if the Democrats were to pick up both seats, Biden were to be in the White House, there'd be a 50-50 tie. So our vice president would then decide who controls the Senate, and that would have a lot of implications that we care about. With regard to the House of Representatives, Brian really was absolutely right. When you look at the races that were the toss-up races right in the middle of the spectrum, what we've seen is the Republicans have won most of those toss-up races. That's a fairly surprising development for people. So House looks like it's going to be more Republican going forward. Whether or not our Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, will be reelected by her caucus, uncertain at this point, probably, but it's uncertain. What I would say is that we'll have the moderates in this situation, in both the House and the Senate, will have more control. It's almost certainly to be very close to being evenly split. We lost, as Brian said, we lost some terrific conservative, moderate to conservative Democrats from oil and gas districts, which is always disappointing, but we'll roll on. The other thing which we haven't talked about, which is just supremely important, is that every 10 years in the United States, we take a census, a survey of how many people are in the United States. And so that census was completed this year in 2020. So for the next 10 years, each state legislature and governor or impartial bodies in certain states will decide how all the lines get drawn on the maps on the electoral lines. And those will be in place for 10 years. The Republicans have largely controlled that process over the last 10 years. The way the elections have gone at the state level, it's likely that they're going to also maintain control in that area going forward. But that's a very important consideration in this election as well. So presidential thing is one thing, but what goes on in Congress in the states is also supremely important to the political situation in the United States. Now, to kind of talking a little bit about EU-US energy cooperation. Look, we've stood shoulder to shoulder with our partners in the EU for a very long time to work on gas, to a situation where the monopolistic power of one particular player has been diminished through competition, through shore-based facilities in places like Poland, floating storage facilities in Lithuania and Croatia, new terminal coming in Greece. It's been designed through cooperation to build a corridor in the eastern part of the bloc from north to south. And that corridor it's progressing very well. We're nearing its completion. and it's already bearing great results. So that's been an important hallmark. That started in the Obama years. That's going to continue regardless of what happens next. We absolutely know how strongly, there was that non-paper that came out that all the member states, bunch of member states signed with regard to the importance of gas going forward. We see gas and LNG cooperation being absolutely unchanged. Look, we've studied deeply the EU methane strategy. We think that Brian again put his finger on it. It's all about data. It's all about transparency. It's all about progress. Methane leaks affect the social license for our industry to operate. And we realize that. We're addressing that in the United States. In fact, we're doing more, I would say, voluntarily and through individual state and federal actions to address that than probably anybody else around the world. We're just now seeing methane satellites go up, and it's going to be real interesting to sort of see as those results come in as to where the human caused leaks are coming from and where the natural leaks are. And it's going to be real interesting to see how the other producers stand. So we're at a really interesting juncture. I'm going to stop here very quickly, James, but let me just say one thing about on LNG cooperation. People seem to forget how this industry, it was built in the United States. So there were two important developments. One is we discovered a process to unlock the gas that was trapped in our shale resources. And so the combination of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling has allowed us to develop our shale resources. It's the largest source of natural gas. In fact, it represents all the growth in natural gas in the last 10 years. So that's one item that people forget. People can be, for or against fracked gas. Well, I got news for you. Fracked gas is shale gas, and shale gas is American gas, and that's the way it is. And it's produced cleanly and efficiently, and so that's an absolute truth. The other thing I would say is that we've dug deeply into this recent news coming out of France, and honestly, I don't see this as some sort of a beginning of a huge wave and a push to change things in Europe. In fact, I just went through this morning very quickly and looked again at the contracts of the EU-based companies that have US LNG long-term contracts. And let me tell you who they are. They're Shell, Naturgy, Total, Centrica, BP, Trafigura, Endesa, Iberdrola, EDF, EDP, PG&IG, Vitol, Edison, Gulp. And EDF and Total signed contracts in 2019 and 2020. So you have the electric utility in France signed a long-term contract in 2020 with regard to buying US LNG. So the notion that somehow we're moving in a situation where it's going to be unacceptable, we don't think that's the case. We think that the industry and the Biden administration will play ball with the commission on the methane strategy. We think we'll have a great partnership to address these issues, which, as Brian said, we have to have a holistic approach. What EU and US in a couple of decades are only going to have half the energy consumption of China. So what we do is important, but what happens in China and India and the rest of the
right, I'm gonna have to jump in. I'm gonna spare you asking a couple of questions, giving you a bit more time than the others to go through your points, which we're very grateful for. And indeed, it's very interesting. And thanks for reminding us of the complexity of the system of governance in the US, because of course we all focus on the presidency. I think the point you make about the EU-US relationship on LNG, I think that this is something we can understand, and we certainly will see that as something as a bipartisan priority going forward. But I want to bring everyone back in. Brian and Charlotte, please come back in, come off mute, because we've got a few questions, which I think actually be interesting for all of you. There's one directly for you, Anne Charlotte, which is coming from Julia Bedini, who's a reporter for MLEX, and she's asking, is hydrogen an area of potential cooperation between the EU and US in the future? And she puts this in the context of Kadri Simpson saying that we need proper rules for trading and moving hydrogen across borders. She also, is the Commission already working on this, already planning to do stuff with the US administration around that? Also interested if Brian or Fred, you have any view on whether or not, how soon would you imagine you could see some hydrogen being developed in the US? But Anne-Charlotte first, because the question was for you, and then maybe just some secondary thoughts from Brian and Fred. Thanks.
Thank you very much, James. So yes, on this question on hydrogen, indeed, it's a promising topic for cooperation between the EU and US, and we are already starting working with the US administration on hydrogen. Just last week, we had a technical video conference with our colleagues in the Department of Energy on hydrogen and future cooperation. So we discussed, each side presented the latest policy developments. The US side was more keen to exchange on research and policy, research and innovation aspects. On our side, we could share, of course, the latest policy developments with our recent hydrogen strategy. There is not yet a clear lead on hydrogen policy on the US side, so we are waiting for this clarification. But yes, certainly we are working with the US already, and we want to deepen this cooperation in view of preparing the working groups of the EU-US Energy Council on energy policy, and later, if possible, in the first half of next year, a meeting of the EU-US Energy Council at ministerial level.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Anne-Charlotte. And I think that's probably a fair point. And it's interesting to see you're already talking to them about it. So that's news as well. So thanks for sharing that. I don't know if Brian or Fred, you have any points of view on US development of hydrogen. I mean, I guess LNG will be the dominant form of energy export for the next 10 years. But anything that you want to say on that point? Also happy to move on if not.
I'll just say this, and this goes back to something that I talk about. Look, whether it's hydrogen, which has great promise, renewable natural gases, which have great promise, battery technologies, carbon capture, pick the technologies, right? For us, it's about scalability. And again, I go back to thinking things decade by decade. If government's trying to push technology policy, generally results in failure. So the markets need to drive that. Technology needs to drive that. And the thought is, can we scale hydrogen to where it becomes legitimate? If the answer is yes, absolutely it should be part of that. But it should be very, very well thought out. And there should be no rush to get to an end goal without thinking through, is it actually doable? So I think it has promise, but until we know if it's scalable or not, I think we got to be very careful about having governments dictate policy in that space.
Yeah, so let me just say a couple of things quickly about hydrogen. My own view is that the US isn't quite as enthusiastic as the EU is about hydrogen. I think that's just the reality under kind of any administration. It does have a lot of promise to decarbonize some very hard to decarbonize parts of everybody's economies, but look, if we're going to really get a handle on climate change, we've got to do things that work in the here and now. I mean, CO2 in the atmosphere is cumulative, and every ton that we can avoid now is a ton that we don't have to, is something we don't have to address in the future through technology. Net zero is a great concept. Every pathway on net zero involves technological breakthroughs, whether it's carbon capture and storage, whether it's in battery technologies, whether it's in hydrogen or something else. And Brian's right. I mean, the market's got to determine what those, what those pathways look like. It's not going to be a pathway. It's going to be pathways.
Thanks for that as well, Fred. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that we can say and that we take there, and I hope that's a good answer for you, Julia. And feel free to follow up if there are any other further questions you have. I'm going to take one more, ladies and gentlemen. We've got 6 minutes. It's coming from Valeria Parmesano, who works for Edison, and she's asking a question, basically saying that the next G20 is going to be, hopefully, I'll say, a post-pandemic one. And the one in 2009 was sort of post, or in the midst of the financial crisis one, and launched important reforms such as the Dodd-Frank in the US. So what expectations do we now have with the new Biden administration in 2021? Is this going to be the time where we get ready to discuss systemic risk and the climate risk with the Biden administration? Can we imagine something like a climate Dodd-Frank type approach from from the US administration? Is that something that you guys would see? I mean, I'll go to Brian first, then Fred, and then Anne-Charlotte to finish with you. And maybe if you want to make any sort of final closing points, this is a good time to do it as well. So Brian, Fred, Anne, how about that?
Thank you. And I think Valera makes a very great point. I mean, one, I would say we don't know what we don't know. And look, between now and when the G20 would be, I think G20 is in June, if that's right. Is that right? I think it's June, July. It's midsummer. I mean, the world changes in 10-minute increments. So I do think there will be some form of risk. And I think she's spot on. We just don't know what that risk is. I do think climate and some form of climate risk will be on the table. But I will say, look, the Saudis, and you start thinking about who are around that table, are going to be very interesting. Do they view risk as the same? And I'm not sure that's correct. So I think it's still TBD, to be determined. And look, and James, and just in closing, one again, and Charlotte, thank you, Fred, James, great to be with you. I think from a US-EU perspective, we should be looking at a couple of big things. One is, I think the 3 Cs initiative is going to be very important for US-EU relations, and how that transport, that goes back kind of to the Nord Stream comment earlier. That group, and I think Biden has a very good perspective on Eastern Europe, that is going to be very important for a Biden foreign policy. And the second thing is, to Fred's point, to meet Paris Net Zero 2050 has to be incremental. And I'm going to give Biden credit that I do not believe he is going to swing very hard left. I think he will be center left. And I think a Republican Senate will help drive some very smart and incremental changes. So I think the relationship with Europe will get better, but I still think there will be tensions. On whether it be defense related, climate related, financial services related, issues with China, which are going to be very important, issues with Iran, very important. So look, if you don't like the way it is now, wait 15 minutes, it's going to change. And again, thank you, James, for the time.
Yeah, I think that's great, Brian, because I think that's what we say. You know, the only thing that's certain is change. So yeah, we're going to live through a time of certainty because we'll see plenty of change. There's no doubt about that. Thanks, Brian, again. Thanks for being with us. Fred, over to you.
Well, listen, everything seems to be changing in 10-minute increments, except this stupid pandemic. I mean, I wish it were changing in 15-minute. Listen, I would love to be going to the World LNG Summit in Rome in December, right? I'd love to be seeing you guys in Brussels face to face and drinking Belgian beer and, having the kind of discussions that we've had previously. Sadly, I think we're looking at this time next year before there's any sort of sense of normalcy return to this. And it's just heartbreaking. It has held us back in the United States. We were ready to do some really useful, interesting things, primarily in Asia on LNG, but elsewhere. And the pandemic has really slowed that down. But we're at record levels of production and record levels of U.S. LNG exports right now. We're excited about the relationship. We're excited that we have you as partners. We're excited about what we can do collaboratively around the world. We're excited to make progress on issues that we all care deeply about, including things like making sure that we continue to have a social license to operate in our business. We take that very seriously, and whether you call it ESG or green finance or dealing with it on a methane strategy or methane leaks, listen, we stand shoulder to shoulder on that. Gas is part of our future, and we're going to make it as clean and acceptable as it should be. Thank you.
That's great. That's great, Fred. And fully agree with that sentiment from Eurogas. Fully support that statement. And Charlotte, I mean, a little spin on the question away. I mean, if there is a Biden administration and they are going to be back in, by the end of January next year, back in the Paris Agreement, is this going to be the extra boost, the wind in your sails to keep that ship on course towards the carbon neutrality 2050, but also at a global level?
Yeah, James, I think the good news with the Biden administration is that US will be back to multilateralism. So US will rejoin the Paris Agreement. US might also rejoin the JCPOA with Iran. And we'll have certainly much easier discussions in the context of the G20. So we are just closing the Saudi presidency of the G20 right now. So we had a hard time negotiating with our Saudi chair, but also with the US on reaching a good result. But we managed. But certainly, I think climate will be back on the table of the G20. So we would be happy to work with the UN in multilateral context, but also as far as our bilateral relationship is concerned, it will remain strong, and so we need this strong EU-US energy partnership. It will become even stronger with the decarbonization that we have, decarbonization agenda that we have ahead of us. I mean, I identified several topics of promising cooperation between us, not only LNG, which will remain, but also hydrogen, energy storage. In the case of natural gas, I think we have all interest to develop a common approach to clean and flexible LNG.
That's great. No, that's great, Anshal. I think we can say that, yeah, whatever happens, we expect, whatever the outcome of the election, we expect a good continued relationship on energy, a good EU-US relationship. But if there's a Biden administration, you said it, it's that multilateralism element which really gets the big push again, which can make a big difference globally. Because at the end of the day, Europe achieving carbon neutrality in 2050 is great, but it doesn't count for anything if the rest of the world doesn't follow suit and achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So I would fully see it in the same way in this respect. The need for all of the big players around the table and getting multilateralism back going would certainly be in the interest of all of us in Europe, and I think all of us in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, we've overshot by 2 minutes.
Exactly, James. So if I may, we represent just 9% of CO2 emissions in Europe, so globally. So EU is just 9%. So we need to work closely with our key partners. Of course, the US is our #1 partner, and we remain our #1 partner.
No, that's perfect. That's a great way to end the show, ladies and gentlemen. And Charlotte said it, the US remains our #1 partner, important for all of our activities, not just our energy ones. As a good friend and ally, also protecting democracy and freedom around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a great afternoon. This is the last Let's Meet of this year. There will be another series coming next year, don't worry. We've been really, really graced to have such knowledgeable experts from Brian, Fred, and Charlotte. Really have to say thank you so much. I must thank you my team as well. When we started this year, we had no idea we'd be doing so many webinars. The pandemic has changed so much for all of us. Of course, we'd love to be doing this in person, but actually, we'd never have been able to do this in person the way we can do it. So we can thank the pandemic for letting us even think of having this election event and talking about EU-US relations and energy relations. And so in many ways, the change that we need is sometimes the change that we don't expect. So let's see what happens in the United States election. There's still probably a few weeks to go before we know for certain, though. You heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. Brian and Fred are both putting their houses on a Biden presidency. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much. Thanks to the team. Thanks to our panelists. Have a great evening, and let's keep the discussion going. Oh, and by the way, the questions we didn't answer, we will answer on LinkedIn. Follow the Eurogas LinkedIn, and we'll put answers to the questions that we didn't get to today. There were plenty of them. Thanks to you, all the participants, for joining us. Hope you found it as interesting, exciting as I did. And let's get back to watching what CNN, Fox, and all the others are telling us is going to happen in the next 24. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Have
James.
a great evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks.